I was sitting at the kitchen table, staring at a bank statement that made no sense. My inheritance account, my grandfather's final gift to me, was nearly empty. Over $2 million, gone. Transferred without my knowledge. The date on the transactions matched the week of our anniversary trip to Napa, when I was too drunk on wine and trust to notice what he was really doing. My name is Amber. I'm 29 years old, and my grandfather left me everything. His hardware empire, his investment accounts, the house he built from scratch in the 60s, it was all mine, and he made sure of it before he died. He told me I was the only one who respected what it took to build something from nothing. But somehow, my husband, Ethan, got into it. And now, I knew. What I didn't know yet was how far he and my family had gone behind my back. But I was about to find out. Ethan had always seemed safe. A quiet accountant with good manners and clean shoes. We met at a friend's wedding 5 years ago, danced twice, and by the end of the night, he'd already asked if he could take me out the following weekend. He was steady, polite, and completely unthreatening. Maybe that's what I liked about him then. I'd grown up in a storm of flashy tempers and broken promises. He wasn't passionate, but he never raised his voice. I thought that was maturity. Looking back now, I see the signs. The careful way he inserted himself into conversations with my grandfather. The questions he asked about assets and trust funds, always wrapped in concern. Always saying things like, "I just want to make sure your family doesn't take advantage of you." The irony makes me sick now. When Grandpa died, it was Ethan who offered to handle the paperwork. I was drowning in grief and the logistics of a sudden funeral. He stepped in like a savior, making calls, organizing documents, answering questions from lawyers. I didn't question it. He was my husband. But that day at the lawyer's office, when the will was read and it became clear that everything, was left to me, I felt the shift in the air. My mother's face turned to stone. My brother Jason, who hadn't even shown up to the hospital, suddenly looked interested. And Ethan. Ethan didn't smile. He didn't even blink. He just reached over and squeezed my hand, like he was claiming something. I remember the exact moment I signed the confirmation papers and Ethan leaned in to whisper, "You're going to be the one they all resent now." I thought he meant it as a warning. The next few weeks were a blur. My mother stopped speaking to me. Jason started sending texts that veiled entitlement as concern. And Ethan, he started staying late at work. Said the extra hours were necessary because now we had responsibilities. He used that word a lot. I was too caught up in the fallout to notice what was happening behind the scenes. Until yesterday. The email was from a junior associate at the bank. A mistake, they said. A routine report that had accidentally been sent to me instead of Ethan. But it had my name on it. My trust. And over $1 million had been moved, slowly, over weeks, to a joint account I didn't even know we had. An account only Ethan had access to. I felt cold in my own skin. Like someone had peeled me open from the inside and hollowed out everything I thought was secure. I confronted him last night. He came home late, smelling like expensive whiskey and hotel soap. I was waiting in the dark, the statement printed and folded beside me like a weapon. He said, "I was protecting us. From your family. From lawsuits. From taxes." I replied, "You stole from me." His face didn't change. That was the most terrifying part. "I'm your husband," he said. "What's yours is mine." I didn't say anything. I just stared at him, long enough that he finally looked away. And in that silence, something settled inside me. A cold, clear edge. I realized I'd been looking in the wrong direction this whole time. It wasn't my mother I had to watch. It was him. This morning, I got a text from my mother. "A family meeting," she said. "Important." Her tone was civil for the first time in weeks. She said Ethan should come too. I knew then something larger was at play. But nothing, could have prepared me for what happened when I walked into that house. She was waiting, not just with my brother and stepfather, but with two unfamiliar men in sharp suits. Ethan was already there, sitting beside her. My mother said, "Meet our lawyers." And that's when the real ambush began. They knew. Somehow, they'd all known before I did. That was the first real betrayal, not the money, but the silence. I sat down slowly, the air heavy with forced civility. My mother gestured toward the empty seat like it was all rehearsed. Like she'd planned the stage and cast the roles, and I was just arriving for the performance. Ethan didn't meet my eyes. His fingers were laced calmly on his lap, the way he always held them when trying to project authority. The taller of the two lawyers cleared his throat. He said, "Thank you for coming, Amber. We just have a few matters to discuss related to your grandfather's estate." It was surreal, hearing someone refer to it like that, your grandfather's estate, when everything inside me still pulsed with the grief of losing him. They said the word like it was an itemized list, not the legacy of the only man who ever truly saw me. I didn't speak. I didn't need to. The room already stank of strategy and lies. The shorter man, his suit too tight around his shoulders, flipped open a folder. He said, "As you know, the estate is considerable. There are ongoing concerns about the structure of the trust, and potential vulnerabilities that could lead to tax exposure, creditor action, or legal contestation from extended family. To avoid complications." My mother interrupted. She said, "We're proposing a consolidation. One clean account, managed by a fiduciary. That way, Amber doesn't have to carry all this alone." That word again, we. As if I was included. As if they were helping me. I glanced at Ethan. He was nodding, expression blank. My throat was dry. I said nothing. I listened. They'd crafted an entire plan, with papers prepared and bullet points highlighted. The goal was to convince me to move everything into a shared holding structure, something vague and benign sounding, that would essentially remove my control. It wasn't subtle. But it was effective. Because for a moment, I almost considered it. They made it sound rational. Prudent. Like I was being difficult for resisting. But I knew what my grandfather wanted. He didn't leave the estate to a committee. He left it to me. Not because I was special. But because I understood. I stood slowly. I said, "Send me the documents. I'll have someone review them." My mother's smile didn't reach her eyes. She always smiled like that before doing something cruel. I walked out of the house feeling like I was carrying a live wire inside my chest. Later that night, I found myself sitting in Grandpa's old study. The room still smelled faintly of cedar and pipe tobacco. I hadn't touched anything since the funeral. I opened the top drawer of his desk and saw the little brass compass he used to carry when we'd go hiking. He used to say it reminded him that even when you don't know where you are, there's always a way forward if you trust your bearings. I held it in my palm and let the weight settle me. My earliest memories are of this house, not the big one with the granite countertops and sharp voices, but this one. The one he built with his own hands when he was still just a man with a dream and a good pair of boots. He taught me to paint baseboards and rewire lamps before I was tall enough to see the top shelf. When I was 6, he let me hold the flashlight while he fixed a burst pipe under the kitchen sink. By 10, I was helping him calculate inventory reorders for his store. I was the only child in the family who could explain a break-even point. He never gave me answers. He asked questions. He made me think. When my mother used to drag me to boutique malls and beauty salons, I'd beg to go back here. To sit in this chair, flipping through his old business journals, pretending I was someone important. He made me feel like I already was. By the time I was 13, I knew more about his company's supply chain than my mother did about our electric bill. He'd bring me to board meetings, pretending I was just there to observe. But then he'd glance my way whenever a number didn't make sense. And afterward, he'd ask me what I thought. That's what made it hurt so much more, not just what they were trying to take from me, but how little they understood the why. The inheritance wasn't just money. It was continuity. Stewardship. My mother saw it as a missed opportunity, something she was entitled to by birthright. But she never sat up late with Grandpa reviewing expense forecasts. She never answered the store's phone at 6 a.m. when a shipment went missing. She never cried in the back office with him when a deal fell through and payroll was due. She wanted the product, not the process. And now, Ethan had become her accomplice. I didn't sleep that night. I sat at Grandpa's desk, reading through his handwritten notes. There were so many things I hadn't noticed before. Quiet instructions. Reminders to himself. One page caught my eye, a list titled Contingencies, if they push Amber. My stomach turned. He knew. He'd known they would come after me. He just hadn't told me how soon. I flipped through the pages and found something else. A name. Someone I didn't recognize, Neil Kravitz, call if pressure escalates. There was a number. I stared at it for a long time, unsure whether to dial. In the morning, I drove to the cemetery. The wind was sharp, biting against my skin. I stood in front of his grave, letting the silence answer what words couldn't. I whispered, "You were right." There was no response, of course. Just the soft rustle of pine branches overhead. Back in my car, I sat there, phone in hand. I dialed the number. A gruff voice answered, "This is Neil." I replied, "My name is Amber." Harold was my grandfather. There was a pause. Then, he said, "I'd been expecting your call." And just like that, the game changed. They'd begun to close in without ever raising their voices. That was the most dangerous kind of betrayal, the kind that smiled at you while tightening the noose. Neil's voice had the cadence of someone used to being obeyed. Sharp, low, deliberate. He wasn't surprised to hear from me. That alone made my pulse quicken. Whatever my grandfather had told him, it must have included predictions about how soon things would unravel. I had no idea who Neil was or what he did, only that he hadn't asked for details. He simply said. "There's a folder. It's in the safe deposit box at First Federal, under your name. You need to retrieve it. Today." I didn't ask questions. I didn't need to. Something about the way he spoke left no room for delay. I ended the call, dressed in silence, and drove through the gray morning haze with the sensation that every moment was shifting something beneath my feet. The box was heavier than I expected. Inside, I found a thick manila folder sealed with a red paper band, a flash drive, and a note in my grandfather's handwriting. "If they turn on you, open this. But only when you're ready." I didn't open it at the bank. I didn't even look at it until I got home and locked every door behind me. I sat at Grandpa's desk again, breathing in the scent of old paper and wood polish, and slowly untied the red band. Inside were neatly arranged documents, scanned emails, printouts of bank transfers, property records, and, what made my chest tighten, an unsigned amendment to the original trust. In it, he outlined what he suspected might happen, a coordinated effort by my mother and Ethan to access the funds, likely through fabricated claims of incapacity or joint marital rights. There was a notation in the margin, underlined twice, "They will use your silence against you." I scrolled through the emails next. Some between Ethan and a man named Gary Whitman, a partner at a boutique law firm I didn't recognize. Others between Patricia, my mother, and Ethan. And then, one I had never expected, Ethan and Jason. My own brother. The emails were strategic, professional in tone, but the implications were unmistakable. They had been planning to challenge the legitimacy of the trust distribution by arguing that I had been coerced or manipulated by Grandpa. That I lacked the financial and emotional maturity to manage such an estate. They weren't just trying to take control of the money. They were preparing to declare me unfit. I felt something shift in me then. A quiet, tectonic movement inside my chest. The kind of change that doesn't make a sound but alters the landscape forever. I didn't cry. Instead, I poured a glass of water, took out a notepad, and began to make a list. By noon, I'd sent a message to the only person I trusted who had no blood ties to me, Nina Gallagher. She'd been Grandpa's corporate attorney for decades, and though she'd gone into semi-retirement, I still had her number. She answered on the second ring. She said, "I was wondering how long it would take." I replied, "I need to understand what I'm looking at." By the end of the call, Nina had agreed to meet me at her private office later that week. She sounded calm, which reassured me. But there was a sharpness in her tone I hadn't heard before. When I told her about Ethan's name on the transfers, she went quiet for a full 10 seconds before saying. She said, "Amber, you need to check your marriage documents." That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay in bed beside a man who had planned to dismantle me, piece by piece, while pretending to care about the cracks. Ethan breathed evenly, one arm draped over his stomach, like nothing had changed. In the dark, I stared at the ceiling and thought about every moment we'd shared. Every time he'd encouraged me to relax, to let him handle it. Every moment I'd mistaken his composure for strength, when in truth, it had been calculation. The next morning, I went to the courthouse and requested copies of our marriage certificate and related legal filings. The woman behind the counter handed me the envelope without so much as a glance. Inside, I found what I was looking for, an addendum signed 2 years ago granting Ethan co-executive status over any marital assets in the event of mental incapacity. The form had my signature. Except, it wasn't mine. It looked close. Close enough that no bank teller would have questioned it. But I knew my own pen strokes, and the curl on the final R in my name wasn't mine. My hands trembled slightly, but I kept my face still. They'd forged my signature. Filed the paperwork. Built a case. And then waited, quietly, patiently, for the right moment to strike. I left the courthouse and sat in my car for nearly 30 minutes, the envelope on my lap, heat blasting against the winter cold outside. For a brief moment, I considered telling someone. A friend. A colleague. But then I remembered Grandpa's words. There will be pressure. Standing your ground won't be easy. So I didn't call anyone. I just drove. I went to the hardware store, one of the original ones Grandpa had started, the only one I hadn't visited since his funeral. The manager recognized me immediately. His name was Phil, and he'd worked there for 30 years. He said, "He always talked about you like you were his legacy." I nodded, trying not to show what that meant to me. Phil led me to the back office where Grandpa used to do his inventory checks. The desk was smaller than I remembered, the corkboard still pinned with old receipts and coupons. There was a photo of me and Grandpa taped to the side, faded but intact. I asked Phil if he'd heard from my mother or Ethan. He frowned. He said, "They came by last week. Said they were restructuring things. Wanted access to employee records and vendor contracts." I replied, "Did they take anything?" He shook his head. I told them to bring documentation. Haven't seen them since. I left a copy of my authorization with Phil and told him I'd be back in 2 days. On the drive home, my chest tightened, not with panic, but with a kind of strange, quiet clarity. They weren't going to stop. And I couldn't pretend I didn't see it coming anymore. That night, Ethan asked if I wanted Thai or Italian for dinner. Like everything was normal. I answered, "I'm not hungry." He didn't push. He never did. I watched him scroll through his phone on the couch, his face a portrait of casual disinterest. But I saw the glance he gave me when he thought I wasn't looking. The calculation. The way a man watches a pot, waiting for it to boil over. I went upstairs and opened the flash drive. What I found made everything else seem like child's play. Because there, buried in a folder labeled bids, was something I hadn't expected. Not just stolen money. Not just fraud. But plans for a full-scale acquisition. A bid to buy out the hardware chain entirely. With my inheritance funding the deal, and Ethan's name on the offer letter. I stared at the screen for a long time, the edges of my vision narrowing. Then I clicked the print button. And for the first time in weeks, I smiled. Just slightly. Because now, I had proof. And very soon, Ethan would know I wasn't the one playing catch-up anymore. Some betrayals feel like a single sharp wound. Others are slower, quieter, a gradual erosion of the ground beneath your feet until one day you simply fall. I didn't fall. Not this time. The printed documents were still warm when I slipped them into a leather folder and locked it in the fireproof safe behind the bookshelf. I'd had it installed after Grandpa died, one of the few precautions I took before I even knew what I was guarding against. Something about grief sharpens your instincts. It was nearly midnight. Ethan was asleep in the guest room now. We'd been taking turns claiming exhaustion for days. In truth, we were orbiting each other like rival diplomats, both pretending the war hadn't started. The hardware chain was the one asset I hadn't touched since the will. Grandpa left it under a holding company, with me as the sole owner. It wasn't glamorous, but it was stable. Profitable. Most importantly, it was his. I hadn't wanted to interfere with the operations, the employees, the store managers, the ecosystem he'd spent decades cultivating. But now I saw the mistake in that. While I was honoring legacy, others were engineering its dismantling. Ethan's name on that bid offer, it wasn't just deceit. It was strategy. He'd positioned himself as the buyer, not me. Meaning the transaction would appear like any other business deal, entirely legal on paper. The chain would change hands, and I'd be left with nothing but hollow titles. Unless I moved first. I reached out to Phil the next morning, asking him to scan all internal communications he'd received from outside contacts in the past 6 weeks. He didn't question it. Within hours, he sent over email logs and a scanned letter, and signed, but clearly drafted on the stationery of Whitman and Fox, the boutique law firm named in Ethan's messages. They were making moves. Quiet, precise, and increasingly confident. I made an appointment with Nina for the following day. Her office was a converted brownstone in the old district, stately, quiet, removed. When I arrived, she ushered me into a room lined with framed case files and photos of her late husband. There was no small talk. She said, "Show me what you've got." I laid it all out. The forged documents. The joint account transfers. The offer letter. The safe deposit contents. Everything. Her face didn't change, but I noticed how she reached for a notepad with one hand while dialing her assistant with the other. She said, "We're filing an injunction. Immediate freeze on all pending transactions and trust activity outside your direct authorization." I nodded, but my throat was dry. She looked up. She said, "This is going to get ugly. You understand that?" I replied, "I'm not afraid of ugly. I'm afraid of silence." By the time I left, the first step was in motion. At home, Ethan pretended not to notice the change in my energy. But I could feel it in the way he hesitated before asking routine questions. The way he watched me too closely when I typed on my laptop. He knew something had shifted. He just didn't know how far I'd gone already. I waited until midnight again before retrieving the folder from the safe and reviewing the backup flash drive. This time, I focused on one folder in particular, conversations. It was a dump of text transcripts, some from Ethan's encrypted chat app, others from his email drafts. I wasn't sure how Grandpa had acquired them. Maybe he'd had help. Maybe Neil had been watching longer than I realized. The messages were clear. Ethan had been planning this for at least a year. Not alone. He had help from Jason. And my mother. I read their names in the messages like acid against paper. They'd discussed my emotional instability, cited selective memories of episodes and withdrawals as evidence I couldn't be trusted with my own legacy. They were laying the groundwork for a conservatorship if the financial pressure failed. They hadn't just stolen. They'd prepared to erase me. The next morning, I did something that surprised even myself. I went to the hardware store and sat down with Phil in the back office. I said, "I want to meet with every store manager. One by one. Privately. Off-site if necessary." No agendas, just conversations. He blinked, then smiled like something long dormant had stirred. He said, "You're your grandfather's granddaughter." The meetings began the next day. One over coffee in a booth at a diner. Another in the back corner of a storage room. I didn't wear suits or heels. I wore what Grandpa used to, pressed flannel, practical shoes, sleeves rolled to the elbow. I asked questions. I listened. And what I heard confirmed what I'd feared. They had all been approached. Phone calls, subtle suggestions, references to imminent ownership changes and streamlined procedures. The language was corporate and cautious, but the implication was clear. Ethan, or someone claiming authority through him, had been positioning for a takeover. He was using Grandpa's own people to do it. But I wasn't angry anymore. I was building. Nina called me 3 days later. The court had accepted the emergency motion. All trust accounts were frozen under judicial oversight until further review. Any action taken by third parties would be subject to civil penalty. It was a wall, not a weapon. But it was enough to slow them down. I drove back to Grandpa's house that night, the one I now owned, and unlocked the cabinet where he kept the old contracts. The silence in the room felt different this time. Not hollow. Not heavy. Just still. Like something waiting. I found what I was looking for, the original vendor and distribution agreements he'd drawn up with suppliers back in the early 2000s. Many of them still active. He'd drafted them in a way that gave the estate, now me, final say in contract renewals. Which meant that even if Ethan acquired operational control, he'd be left with skeleton stores. The leverage was real. I copied the contracts and made notes for Nina. Then I packed a small bag and drove back to the city. Ethan was in the kitchen when I walked in. Cooking something elaborate. The smell of saffron and garlic filled the space. He turned, smiling faintly. He said, "Didn't think you'd be home tonight." I replied, "I changed my mind." He poured wine. Offered a glass. I declined. He watched me for a moment, that same faint smile stitched to his face. He said, "You've been busy." I didn't answer. I just looked at him. He tilted his head, studying me. He said, "You're different." I replied, "No. I've just stopped pretending." He paused for a moment, as if trying to decide whether to keep playing the role. Then, softly, he said, "Are we going to be okay?" It was a strange question. He already knew the answer. But asking it gave him a moment of power, of nostalgia. I didn't give him that moment. I said nothing. That night, I slept in my own bed for the first time in weeks. Alone. Unafraid. The following morning, I received an email. It was from a private investigator. The subject line read, requested findings, Ethan Spencer, prior holdings and undisclosed assets. I opened it slowly. And what I found made everything else look like child's play. The man I had married was a fraud long before he touched my money. But I was the one who'd signed the vows. I'd said yes to a mask and called it a face. The report from the private investigator was 13 pages long. But it only took one to make my hands go cold. 2 years before we met, Ethan had co-owned a consulting company with a man named Gary Whitman, yes, the same name on those law firm emails. The business dissolved after a quiet lawsuit from a former client who alleged embezzlement. No formal charges. No publicity. Settled quietly. On page 3 was a scanned check, signed by Ethan, made out to a holding company I didn't recognize, dated 6 weeks after my grandfather's funeral. The same week Ethan had accidentally misplaced the password to our joint account. I flipped through the rest mechanically. Rental properties. Offshore accounts. 3 P.O. boxes in 3 different states. Nothing in his name directly. But all of it funded by transfers that began with me. And then there was the line that made my stomach turn, Communication recovered from encrypted messages between Spencer and Whitman indicates intent to relocate capital and dissolve current marriage once trust restructure is finalized. He hadn't just planned to drain me. He planned to leave me empty and discarded once it was done. I didn't cry. Not even then. Instead, I printed the report, slid it into the same leather folder I'd carried to Nina's office days earlier, and drove to her brownstone without calling first. When I arrived, she was already in a meeting with someone I didn't recognize, a man in his 60s, sharp suit, wire-rimmed glasses, posture like a judge. She waved me in. She said, "Amber, this is Judge Ellison. Retired, but still dangerous." I handed him the folder. He didn't speak while reading. Just flipped page by page, eyebrows low, mouth tight. Then he said, "We'll need to move quickly. This is bigger than civil litigation." I sat in the corner chair, knees together, hands flat on my thighs like a schoolgirl waiting for her turn. But inside, everything had stilled. My body had caught up with what my mind already knew. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This was an attack. And I wasn't going to beg for my place in a house I owned. By the end of that meeting, I had a strategy. We would confront them, not one by one, not in silence, not over wine and veiled threats, but all at once, with documentation, legal muscle, and leverage. I wanted them exposed in a setting they couldn't twist into something else. We scheduled a mediation. Nina sent the invites. To my mother. To Jason. To Ethan. And to Gary Whitman, under his professional title, because I wanted him there too. I wanted him in the room when the scaffolding they'd built began to collapse. The date was set for the following Thursday, at a private conference room in Nina's building. Formal setting, neutral territory, and no room for posturing. The morning of the meeting, I dressed carefully. Not in black. Not in armor. But in soft blue, the same shade my grandfather once said made me look honest, even when you're scheming. I didn't want to look powerful. I wanted to look exactly like what I was, calm, focused, and finished with apologies. They arrived one by one. My mother came in first, lips painted, hair set, wearing the same smug expression she'd worn to Grandpa's funeral. She didn't greet me. Jason followed, tapping at his phone until he noticed Ethan trailing behind him. Ethan nodded at me, eyes flat. No surprise. Just calculation. Gary was last. Tall, silver-haired, expressionless. He was the first to speak. He said, "I assume we're here to reach an amicable resolution." I replied, "No. We're here to clarify ownership and expose criminal intent." But please, continue. Nina distributed copies of the report. One by one, they took the folders in silence. There was no performance, no gasp, no dramatic reveal. Just quiet page-turning and tightening jaws. My mother's hand trembled. Jason's face flushed. Ethan didn't blink. Gary looked up last. He said, "These documents were obtained illegally." Nina didn't look up from her notes. She said, "They weren't." Ethan cleared his throat. He said, "Amber, I think this has all been blown out of proportion." I met his gaze. I replied, "I think that phrase has done more damage to women in rooms like this than any weapon." Silence again. Then my mother, voice thin. She said, "What do you want?" I turned to Nina. She passed me a second folder. Inside were the demands: immediate relinquishment of any claim to the estate, public withdrawal of Ethan's offer to acquire the hardware chain, formal revocation of all forged documents, and a non-disclosure agreement forbidding any public commentary on the trust or its beneficiaries. If they signed, they would walk away empty but unharmed. If they refused, Nina was prepared to launch full civil and criminal proceedings. Gary asked for time to review. Nina refused. She said, "You knew this was coming. You didn't prepare your clients?" He said nothing. My mother tried once more. She said, "We're family." I looked at her, really looked at her, for the first time in weeks. She hadn't aged, not on the surface. But her voice had lost its varnish. It trembled now, no longer sure which role she was playing. I replied, "You stopped being family the day you tried to dismantle what he built." Jason didn't speak. He didn't even look up. He just signed. Ethan hesitated. Then did the same. Only my mother waited. When she finally signed, it was with the slumped shoulders of someone who realized the performance was over and no one was applauding. The meeting ended quietly. No one hugged. No one raised their voices. They filed out like strangers who'd once shared a house and now didn't know where to park. I stayed behind with Nina. She poured us each a glass of water, her version of a toast. She said, "You handled that with restraint." I answered, "I learned from the best." We didn't speak for a while after that. There was nothing left to say. But just before I left, I asked her to keep one copy of the documents sealed in her archives, just in case. She nodded. I stepped out into the daylight, not victorious, but whole. Not healed, but honest. When I got home that evening, the house was quiet. There were no flowers from Ethan. No calls from my mother. Only a letter, placed neatly on the kitchen counter. It was addressed to me, in Jason's handwriting. I opened it slowly. And what he wrote inside was something I never expected to read. I unfolded the letter expecting another excuse, maybe even a thin apology designed to protect him legally. But what I found inside wasn't a plea, it was a confession. Jason's handwriting was familiar in the way old scars are. Slanted slightly to the left, precise, but never quite confident. He started by saying he knew I'd never forgive him, and that he wasn't asking for that. He just wanted to tell the truth, even if it came late. He admitted he'd joined Ethan and my mother not because he hated me, but because he didn't believe I'd fight back. Because in our family, I was the one who always turned the other cheek. Who worked harder in silence while they took more than their share. He called it habitual entitlement, and for once, I believed he understood the shape of his betrayal. But the part that stopped me was this. You were never the weak one, Amber. You were the one who endured us. That's different. I see that now. I read it 3 times before folding it back and placing it in the drawer beneath the sink, the one Grandpa used to keep spare batteries and old stamps in. I didn't feel lighter, exactly. But the sharpest edge of the bitterness softened. The following weeks moved slowly, like an aftermath. The legal paperwork was finalized. Ethan's name was formally removed from all trust-related accounts. The acquisition attempt was dissolved. Gary Whitman's license was flagged for review, Nina made sure of it, and a quiet ethics board investigation began moving through the motions. I didn't follow up. I didn't need to. The house felt different. Still, but not empty. I spent mornings walking through rooms I used to avoid. The sunroom. The downstairs office. Even the attic, where I found old boxes of Grandpa's ledgers, each one dated and labeled in his steady handwriting. I began sorting them in the evenings, not because I had to, but because I wanted to feel close to something uncorrupted. I didn't hear from Ethan again. Not directly. But one afternoon, I received a package, no return address, just my name written in block letters. Inside was the watch I gave him on our first anniversary. I'd engraved it with "You Steady Me." I hadn't meant it as irony then, but now it felt like a sick joke. He'd kept it. Or maybe he was giving it back as a final gesture, a way to rewrite the ending as something less grotesque. I placed it in the drawer with Jason's letter. Not as a keepsake. As evidence. Barbara from Grandpa's accountant firm called later that week. She'd found discrepancies in the expense reports Ethan had submitted before I took over. Small things, ghost vendors, padded supply invoices, non-existent maintenance costs. Nothing large enough to alert tax authorities, but enough to bleed the company over time. She said, he was starving it slowly. Like he thought you wouldn't notice until it was too late. I replied, he was right. But only for a while. We went through the statements together, line by line. I authorized corrections, reissued proper vendor agreements, and personally contacted every major supplier with a statement of continuity. The managers appreciated the clarity. Phil sent me a note that said simply, "We're still with you." It meant more than I expected. I started making weekly rounds at the stores. Quietly, without announcements. I'd show up, observe, speak to the floor staff. Not to micromanage, but to understand. To reconnect. My grandfather used to say the numbers would tell you how the business was doing, but the people would tell you how it was living. One Saturday, I walked into the flagship store and saw a young woman at the register, no more than 20, wearing a faded polo that hung awkwardly off her shoulders. She was helping an older man find a specific type of door hinge. When he left, she turned and noticed me watching. She said, "I'm sorry, did you need something?" I smiled. I replied, "No. I just wanted to say thank you for taking care of this place." She blinked, confused, then nodded. I left before she could ask who I was. I didn't need recognition. I needed roots. The chain stabilized quickly once the dust settled. In 6 months, we posted the strongest Q2 growth in over a decade. Nina called it a quiet resurrection. I called it survival. I redecorated the upstairs bedroom. The one Ethan never entered, claiming the lighting was bad. I filled it with second-hand furniture, framed blueprints Grandpa once sketched by hand, and a simple writing desk where I started keeping my own ledgers. Not just financials. Thoughts. Reflections. Promises to myself. I never moved out of the house. People asked why. Some thought it must have held painful memories. But to me, it was a reclamation. It had been his sanctuary, and now it was mine. Not in a romantic way, just in the way that some places fit your silence better than others. Occasionally, I'd hear updates. Ethan moved to Nevada. Opened a small consulting firm. Probably with a different name on the paperwork. My mother took a part-time job at a gallery uptown. Jason moved out of state, apparently working for a logistics company. None of them reached out again. But I received one last letter. From Neil. Just a short note, written in neat block letters like a military memo. You did more than survive. You inherited his vision. Don't forget what that means. There was no return address. Just his initials on the back of the envelope. I placed it in the same drawer as the others. One afternoon, as I sat on the back porch, I noticed the way the sunlight moved across the stone path Grandpa laid himself. It was uneven, not professionally done, but it held. It had lasted longer than any of us. That night, I began drafting a new kind of trust. One that wasn't just about protecting money, but about preserving principles. I named it after him. Not to honor the man who gave me everything, but to remind myself never again to give anything away for free. Especially not my trust. Weeks passed. Then months. The quiet no longer felt like aftermath. It felt like peace. Until one morning, I checked the mailbox and found a single envelope with no stamp. Inside was a photograph. A child, about 5 years old, with Ethan's eyes. And a handwritten note in a woman's cursive. You don't know me, but I think you need to know him. Some truths arrive too late to change anything. Others arrive just in time to make you question everything you thought was finally behind you. The child in the photograph had Ethan's chin, the same solemn curve to the mouth, like he was already suspicious of the world. His eyes, though, there was something unguarded there. Curious. Vulnerable in a way Ethan never allowed himself to be. He couldn't have been older than 5. The envelope had no return address, no phone number, no indication of who the woman was. Just a line in unfamiliar, elegant handwriting, "You don't know me, but I think you need to know him." I sat with the photograph on my lap for nearly an hour. I didn't cry. Not from anger, not from sadness. I didn't even feel betrayed, not in the way I had before. I just felt still. The worst part wasn't what it revealed. It was how unsurprising it felt. I placed the photo on my desk and went upstairs. That night, I barely slept. My mind wasn't racing, it was sifting. Sorting through memory, weighing what I knew against what I'd chosen not to see. The quiet phone calls Ethan used to take in the guest bathroom. The unexplained charges on his travel cards. The way he once flinched when I asked if he'd ever wanted kids. He said no, back then. He said he wasn't made for it. Now I knew better. By morning, I had made my decision. I wasn't going to chase answers. I wasn't going to call whatever number I could track down or start some mess of a correspondence with a woman who'd decided to send me this revelation like a postcard. If Ethan wanted me to know about this child, he would have told me. He hadn't. So I placed the photo back in the envelope, sealed it, and tucked it away in the same drawer where I'd been keeping the remnants of everything he and my family had tried to take from me. Not out of denial. But because not every battle belongs to us. Some storms are meant to pass through without us stepping into the rain. In the weeks that followed, I returned to my work with quiet devotion. Not as a retreat, but as a redirection. The hardware chain entered a new phase of renovation, both physically and operationally. I'd hired 2 young women from a nearby trade school to oversee sustainability projects across locations. They reminded me of myself, sharp, underappreciated, and quietly relentless. One afternoon, Phil caught me reviewing blueprints in the back office of the flagship store. He said, "Your grandfather used to do the same thing. Wouldn't go home until every tape measure was back in its drawer." I smiled. I replied, "Some things are worth doing the long way." He nodded, then paused. He said, "You think he knew it'd fall to you like this?" I looked out the window, where the late sun was hitting the cracked parking lot just right, turning everything gold. I answered, "I think he hoped it wouldn't have to." But I didn't resent it anymore. That was the shift. There's something deeply human about craving fairness. Justice. Closure. I used to think I couldn't rest until every lie was exposed, every false smile dragged into the light. But the truth is, peace doesn't come from retribution. It comes from reclaiming the space where your voice was once ignored. It comes from building something stronger than the silence they left you in. Eventually, I sold one of the smaller properties Grandpa had left me, a cottage near the edge of town, overgrown with ivy and half-collapsed in the back. I didn't sell it for profit. I sold it to a local nonprofit that converted old spaces into emergency shelters for women and children. The paperwork was signed on a Thursday. I visited the site one last time that weekend. The ivy had been trimmed back. The front porch was swept clean. I stood at the edge of the gravel path, hands in my coat pockets, and felt something loosen in my chest. Not grief. Not pride. Just breath. A few days later, I received a card in the mail. No envelope, no name. Just a simple white card with a handwritten message. "You left it better than you found it." He would have been proud. I don't know who sent it. Maybe Phil. Maybe Nina. Maybe no one I'll ever identify. But I believed it. One morning in early spring, I stepped outside to find the first green shoots pushing through the frost-hardened soil in the garden Grandpa used to call his accidental orchard. It hadn't produced fruit in years. But there it was, life, again, insisting on itself. I didn't pick up the phone to tell anyone. I just stood there in the chill, watching the light catch on something that hadn't bloomed in a long time. That night, I wrote a letter, not to Ethan, not to my mother, not even to the boy whose face I would likely never see again. I wrote it to myself. I didn't start with Dear Amber. I didn't start with anything soft. I just wrote. You did not break. And for the first time in what felt like a decade, I believed it. That's the thing no one tells you about survival. It's not loud. It's not a crescendo. It's quiet. Patient. A long road with no audience and no applause. But somewhere along the way, it stops being about what they did to you, and becomes about what you decided to build anyway. I folded the letter, slipped it into the back of my ledger, and turned out the light. Some endings don't need to be rewritten. They just need to be walked away from. And I did.